Hi, this week will be in Obadiah. So, Obadiah is really God's judgment upon the nation Edom. We don't know much about the historical situation, about the letter. We'll cover some of that during our Sunday school time. But really, it's an announcement of judgment for Obadiah, or for Edom's sin of pride. And so their pride has been demonstrated. You see this in a number of different verses, but you see it in verse 2 and in verse 3. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. So he's bringing them down. Why does he need to bring them down? Well, verse 3 tells us the pride of your heart has deceived you. And so they've been deceived by their pride. And you see that their pride is evident in even how they have positioned themselves. They believe that they're unable to be attacked. Your habitation is high, verse 3 tells us. And all this is something that the Lord himself is speaking to them in verse 4. From there I will bring you down, says the Lord. Right? And then he goes on and he talks about how he's going to judge them. And he tells them that the judgment is going to be severe, it's going to be complete, and it is not something they're going to be able to escape. He highlights this in a number of different uh, heavy illustrations. He talks about a robber coming in, and he says, if a robber were to come into your presence, would he not only just take what he wants, right? So if a robber were to come into my office, he might steal my laptop, and he might steal my computer, and he might steal my screen, and maybe a couple other electronical things. But really, is he going to steal the 700 books that I have in here? Probably not, because they're not going to be very valuable to him. Unless he knows what he's looking for, and if he does, he probably shouldn't be robbing them because he should be believing what they say. Anyways, that's kind of the idea, is that a robber doesn't steal everything that's available to be stolen. He would leave something. He has a little bit of mercy in what he does. Same thing, he goes on, he talks about the grape gatherer, how they would leave something, but God himself is not going to leave something. He's going to completely annihilate those who have disobeyed him and who have disobeyed him. And so this is seen in verses 8 and 9. He talks about the wise men are going to be removed. He talks about the mighty men who are going to be removed. And this is all because of their pride and how it's manifested itself to the brother Jacob, right? So this goes back into some of the historical stuff. I'll probably highlight some of it in my sermon, but very, very briefly, just because we don't have a lot of time. We'll talk more about it during the Sunday school time. But pretty much Jacob and Esau, they're brothers, and they should have treated them better. And so verses 10 through 14 just goes through and highlights how they should have treated them differently, and they did not treat them well. And so verses 13 and 14 specifically highlight 8 different ways in which they should not have acted. You should not have entered the gate of my people. You should not have gazed on their affliction, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroad. Nor should you have delivered up those among whom you remained in the day of distress. So just a whole bunch, and it actually starts in verse 12. Sorry. So it starts in verse 12. Nor should you have rejoiced, nor should you have spoken. So those are all the 8 different illustrations right there, right? 6 of them in verse 13 and 14, 2 of them in verse 12. So then what he announces, in light of their pride and their arrogance, what is God going to do, right? Because really, there's a very real sense in which I don't think the letter is written to Edom. Okay, this is going to happen. They are prideful, they are arrogant, they're unwilling to change, so God is going to judge. It's not so much written to Edom as it is to God's people who are facing this horrible situation that's described in verses 10 through 14. They can be encouraged, they can find hope in the fact that God has set a day aside. And it's interesting as you read through this text, the emphasis on the idea of day. You see it in verse 8, I will not in that day. You see it again in verses 10 through 14 a couple of times. In the day, verse 11. Verse 12, gazed on the day of your brother. Verse 12, in the day of their destruction. Verse 12 ends in the day of distress. Verse 13, in the day of their calamity. 13 in the day of their calamity, verse 13 in the day of their calamity. So there's this idea of calamity in verse 14, in the day of distress. So there's this idea of there's been a day of distress, but there's coming a worse day of distress. And this worst day of distress is God's day of judgment upon all the nations for their lack of obedience to the Lord. And so he's going to pay them back equivalent to what they deserve. It may look like it's above what it should be, but in God's eyes, this is equivalent. And it will bring about holiness, and it will bring about physical blessings. Not only that, but this is God accomplishing what he desires. And what he desires really is justice. It's goodness for them. Because notice verse 21 says, then saviors, or these are deliverers, these are God's agents of justice, are going to go out from Mount Zion, the holy mountain, to judge the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. It really ends on actually a very high note for the nation of Edom. God's people are going to administer justice. And so it ends on a good note. Anyways, so that's the text. I'll send out some questions accompanying this video, and we'll see you on Sunday.